Welcome back to Pearl Magazine. The U.S.-China trade war was reignited this year after U.S. President Donald Trump came back into office and promptly slapped China with 10% tariffs on all imports. Just a few short months later, that number has risen to 145%. Trying to keep up with the daily changes is a challenge. Let's take a look at how we got to where we are today. The U.S. and China held their first face-to-face discussions on tariffs in Switzerland. U.S. President Donald Trump said the discussions were a total reset negotiated in a friendly but constructive manner, while Xinhua said the talks were an important step in promoting the resolution of the issue. In Trump 2.0, Trump has declared tariffs on just about every country he can. Recently, the tax-free status of items valued at $800 or less sent to the U.S. was terminated on May 2. Known as the de minimis loophole, it was introduced in the U.S. in 1938 to eliminate the burden of collecting negligible duties on low-value goods at a high cost to the government. A report from the Congressional Research Service shows that from 2018 to 2023, the value of low-value e-commerce exports from China ballooned from $5.3 billion to $66 billion US. Companies like Temu and Shein have been using the loophole to serve U.S. customers. Temu is now only listing products that have been stored in warehouses in the U.S., but how long stocks will last there is unclear. And it's not just Chinese online platforms affected, but sellers from every country selling into the U.S.
The U.S. is still the #1 consumer market in the world. And those U.S. consumers are very important in the eyes of not just those Chinese manufacturers, but every manufacturer globally. When we see the U.S. administration turning off the tap in terms of parcels to the U.S., equally, we're gonna look very carefully to see, well, what's happening around the region. And the reality is that we are still in early days. We're still really looking at the fallout. The reality is that we are gonna see a pivot to those new markets.
Here's what's happened since Trump has taken office. After the 10% tariffs imposed by the U.S. in February, China fired back with 15% tariffs on U.S. coal, LNG, plus tariffs on crude oil and agricultural products. By April, the U.S. had imposed up to 145% in cumulative tariffs. Trump cited trade imbalances and the fentanyl crisis as the reason. China immediately responded with 125% tariffs and export bans on 7 rare earth elements. Both countries added tech and defense-related restrictions. At this point, China's foreign ministry said they wouldn't engage in the numbers game since anything after 145% wasn't serious. At the start of Trump's term, former U.S. Consul General to Hong Kong and Macau Kurt Tong said it was unclear what the tariffs were being used for.
The internal discussion process around what policies to pursue as president is still confusing and combative. The fact that if you put tariffs so high that it prevents all trade, then you're actually not raising any revenue because there's no trade which to tax. And most importantly, what is the purpose of this tariff initiative? Is it to raise revenue? Is it to punish the Chinese economy for having been unfair to the United States? Or is it part of a negotiation? Or is it, what is the intended final state of affairs? Does he actually think that a decoupling of the US and Chinese economy is the best thing for the United States, or is this part of a negotiation?
Last year, China's imports to the U.S. made up almost 14% of total imports. China is the second largest importer to the U.S. after Mexico, and electronics tops that list. China provides 26.2% of all U.S. electrical imports. 81% of smartphones imported to the US are made in China, and 90% of iPhones sold in the US come from China. Shortly after the announcement of 145% tariffs, Trump exempted electronic goods from China, which included smartphones, laptops, and electronic screens. And China removed tariffs on US semiconductors. In the last 2 weeks, Trump has repeatedly said he's in talks with China and has even claimed to have spoken with President Xi Jinping. But he won't say when. On April 27th, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said he couldn't confirm this, and Chinese officials outright denied it.
中美双方并没有就关税问题进行磋商或谈判。
Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun described it as fake news that there were no ongoing negotiations between the two parties, and added the trade conflict was provoked by Washington and China is willing to fight to the end. He stressed any talks between the two nations must adhere to the principles of mutual respect and equality. Retaliations continue, including China canceling Boeing orders, a major hit as China makes up 15% of the global aviation market.
I think it's quite clear that Beijing's been preparing a whole slew of measures to use as counter leverage towards the United States in this economic policy struggle. Those include export controls, various administrative measures, China's own tariffs on U.S. goods, and also, most fundamentally, the willingness or unwillingness to negotiate under the pressure of tariffs from the U.S.
Meantime, President Xi Jinping has continued to meet with leaders from around the world to work out agreements with them. China has urged nations to stand up to the unilateral bullying from the U.S. and warned countries not to make deals with the U.S. that are detrimental to China.
You know, if we look at East Asia, we now see the trade ministers of China and Japan and South Korea coming together and talking shop. We're going to continue to see President Xi Jinping do his tour of the region. And we noticed that, of course, he was traveling in a number of those ASEAN countries, right? China are going to use this soft diplomacy to see how they can work with those regional economies.
And there are opportunities with ASEAN. Malaysia has called for ASEAN to act strategically as a bloc to deal with the tariffs.
The one thing about China is their technology, and is there an opportunity there to share that technology? Their know-how on infrastructure, being able to build that infrastructure. You know, again, that is where I think China can positively work together with their neighbors. RCEP, right, the regional cooperation for economic partnership. And it was all of those ASEAN bloc countries with China, with South Korea, with Japan, the first time that some of these countries have actually signed up between each other for FTAs, along with Australia and New Zealand. The Middle East is an area that China has been developing with the likes of Saudi Arabia, and also Latin America. I think it's particularly interesting that, of course, you know, we have seen President Xi Jinping travel to Central and South America. If I'm sitting in Mexico City, or if I'm sitting in places like Sao Paulo, then I'm also looking north and thinking, you know, can we do business with the US? Or do we also need to look east or west?
And while the U.S. raises tariffs on virtually every country in the world, including their traditional allies, China has been in talks with the EU to strengthen alliances.
I'm sure China look at the European Union and, you know, have a number of trade talks, and they're already talking about the likes of EVs.
Yes.
And that is another interesting development. China is, for me, one of the ultimate trading nations. And, you know, we're going to continue to see trade. China is going to find a way to trade because traders.
As for the rare earth restrictions, China currently controls about 70% of the world's rare earth extraction and 90% of rare earth processing. These are critical in making everything from smartphones and semiconductors to fighter jets, precision lasers, and high-frequency radar. Recently, the U.S. signed a deal with Ukraine giving the U.S. preferential access to new Ukrainian minerals and natural resources licenses, which Trump hopes will give the U.S. access to much-needed rare earth materials.
When we're talking about mining and putting in that infrastructure, this doesn't take a few months, Melissa. The reality is we're talking about 5 to 10 years in terms of those cycles. And quite frankly, that's time that China has versus time that President Trump's administration. It's going to take the US considerable amount of time to get their rare earth initiative moving.
Over the weekend, the U.S. agreed to lower tariffs on Chinese goods to 30%, while China agreed to lower duties on U.S. imports to 10%. China says there are plans to set up a joint mechanism for communications related to trade and commercial issues between the two countries.